With the cost of buying a home for many Canadians feeling out of reach, especially in some of the larger city centers like Toronto and Vancouver, many have turned to consider the idea of house hacking as a means to not only get into the housing market for those who are unable to purchase a home without renting a portion, but for some others, it's also a means to maybe fast track their way to Canadian financial freedom. However, a recent concern was expressed from the Canadian wealth secret seeker community, specifically whether giving up a portion of the capital gains exemption on your primary residence here in Canada was worth house hacking for. You know how this former high school math teacher gets when there's an opportunity for a solid financial analysis to dig into. I simply couldn't help myself. So today we are going to dig in and take a look at what you're gaining or losing when you start contemplating whether a Canadian house hack is worth the effort and the sacrifices. So let's dig in. All right, my friends. So as mentioned here in the intro, I was on a call with a listener from this particular podcast. And, we were discussing the idea of house hacking and something that sometimes we miss along the way when we're creating content is what people know and what people don't know about different strategies that exist for us as Canadians. And, we talk a lot about things like the Smith maneuver and cash flow damming, and we talk about corporate wealth strategies and different ways that we can invest our capital in order to optimize our financial future. And sometimes we miss opportunities to allow people to dig in and really think about some of the strategies that are sitting right before them. And one of them is this idea of a house hack. Now, on the surface, it seems like a logical move, right? When you house hack, basically what you're doing is you're going to give up a portion of that home in order to earn some income. And along with that, that income usually can help offset some of the costs. Now, there's a lot of research out there. We're not going to cite it today in this particular episode, but there's a lot of research that suggests that actually renting is the smarter option from a rational perspective in many markets, as long as you invest the difference. And that's where things tend to fall apart, is that as Canadians, when we rent, we tend to learn to live within our means, and rent, the actual cost of rent, is the means that we're using. And we fail to sort of think about what would we have to be paying if we owned a home, including the expenses, and taking those savings and actually doing something about it. So what ends up happening is a lot of times renters end up with less than homeowners. And that's why we have this idea in our mind that owning a primary residence is a smart financial decision. So again, it turns out that it is a smart financial decision because from a emotional perspective, we tend to allow lifestyle creep to sort of waste away some of the savings that we would actually have through renting. So for those who are thinking to themselves, I'm renting right now and I'm not able to afford purchasing a home, or those people who maybe have a home and they're thinking to themselves, maybe, house hacking could be an opportunity for us to take the right step or the next step in our financial freedom journey. This episode's for you. And we're going to go through some of the pros and cons. So as I mentioned, this idea came to us from a call. We had a client who was actually renting at the time and has been considering purchasing a primary residence. And we talked about all the reasons why buying a primary residence actually isn't the best move if your number one goal is simply getting to become financially free. Right. And as I just mentioned, a lot of costs to home ownership introduces a lot of problems. Now, of course, a lot of people like owning their home. I own my primary residence, but the reality is that my primary residence is actually quite costly. The actual property itself, the home that we chose to build, the finishes that we have there, there's a lot of money that we would call, from a rational perspective, that we've sort of wasted here. However, this is the lifestyle that we're choosing. We actually want this as a part of our life, and we are happy to commit that portion of capital or that portion of our income in order to achieve the result that we have here. Now, for this individual, they were sort of stuck on the idea of, potentially buying a primary residence, not wanting to, again, overspend, so to speak, compared to what they're paying in rent. This individual was actually renting in a shared unit, meaning, they were actually like rent hacking in a way. So him and a couple other people were actually sharing the rent. So you talk about that and you go, holy smokes, he was paying very, very little, and therefore had quite a bit of income that they were able to reallocate into other investments. It's a great move if owning your own home isn't maybe a goal of yours. It's also an easier move if, let's say, you're single and you don't necessarily have other dependents. So, for example, my spouse was not interested in house hacking, and that was just something that was not going to work well for her. Now, me being the person I am, when we first got married, we moved into our home. We could have easily converted the basement of that property, and it actually had a nice walkout to the garage. So it would have been a great move. However, it just wasn't in the cards. So depending on where you are in your life, in your journey, and who it is that you have to make these decisions with, those can be some of the hangups that you run into. Of course, there's some reasons why, say, my spouse did not want to do this. One is the loss of privacy, for example, sharing that space, the loss of, I guess it's connected to privacy, but, this idea that you have to sort of creep around the house, especially if, you live in the main floor unit and they live in the basement, and, you don't want to have music or the TV on too loud, too late at night, or you don't want to, be worried about stepping or stomping around or having too many friends over. So there's a lot of things that sort of go or work against you from doing a traditional house hack, especially if we're thinking about like converting a basement, which seems to be one of the most common strategies. So, there's a lot of reasons why people don't. However, for those who are considering it, you may have had this idea, and this is what sparked this episode, was around the idea that if, let's say, I was to take my primary residence, which has a capital gains exemption, meaning I could own this home because I live in it and I use it as my primary place of residence, I can hold this home for as long or as little as I'd like. I shouldn't say as little. There are some rules in place. You have to own it for a certain amount of time. Now it's, I think it's 24 months. Don't quote me on that, but, just to try to avoid house flipping and so forth, you do have to own it for at least a minimum amount of time, a couple years or so. But then anytime after that, if you sell your property, you can keep the gain without being taxed on it, which is quite nice, right? If you bought a property for $200,000 and then it's worth $1 million after some time, you get a full $1 million out of that home without having to pay any capital gains taxes. So some people might be thinking, if I'm going to sacrifice half of this capital gains exemption, like what's that going to look like and sound like? And is it even really worth it in the long run, right? When we actually look at it from a long-term standpoint, you might be wondering, like, am I actually losing out here? And I'm going to break this down for you. We'll look at a spreadsheet in a second to kind of take you through those ideas. So first off, let's talk about what you're gaining when you house hack. So when you house hack, you are, of course, gaining, a tenant, and you're gaining some, inconveniences that go along with it. Right now, all of a sudden, if something goes wrong in that portion of the home, while I'm very good at ignoring those types of things in my own home and fixing them later or dealing with them later, you now have a tenant, and therefore you're going to have to go and do some of those things. You're going to have to fix those things. You're going to have to stay on top of those things. However, what you're also getting is some monthly income, right? And that varies, of course. We'll talk about some different values or rents that might be reasonable for a basement unit. But then you also get the tax deduction on that portion of things like mortgage interest, property taxes, utilities, even potentially depreciation of the property if you choose to do depreciation. Okay, so we're not going to get into the depreciation nuances here today. We're just going to look at sort of the main ones, which is, property tax, mortgage interest, utilities, property insurance, for example, is another one. But then there's also aspects too of like things that you do to fix the home. So when there's repairs and maintenance, if it's that portion of the home, you are also able to write off those portions as well, right? So these are really important parts to consider. So you are getting monthly rental income, but you are able to deduct portions of these other expenses, which means you might have money coming in that is actually not taxable. In a perfect world, you might bring in $2,000, and all of the expenses associated with that portion of the home, that percentage of the home, would be $2,000, and you wouldn't pay any tax, and you just have $2,000 in your pocket that you never had before. Now, again, you're sacrificing that portion of the home, but in an easy, in a sort of a simple world, that might be sort of something for you to consider and think about. So if I think about that $2,000 a month for 12 months, all of a sudden now we have $24,000 that I never had before in my pocket. And in that perfect world scenario, there was no tax on the 24,000 because all of the expenses that we were tax deductible related to that portion of the home are also there for me. So that's $24,000. You multiply that out however many years you choose to do this house hacking, and you are putting yourself in a very, very interesting spot. So what I'm going to do here today is actually sort of break things down for you. If you're on YouTube, do us a huge favor, subscribe, hit the bell button. That'll help notify you when we release new content. And of course, leave us a comment. Let us know what you're thinking, things that we miss. Like, let's be honest, we're throwing out this content, doing our best to try to be as informative as possible. But by no means are we suggesting that there's no other considerations out there, right? So we want to just bring this to your mind so that you have some perspective when you start analyzing some of these possibilities. So let's take a look at the spreadsheet now. Now, back in, I think it was so this would have been a few months back from when this episode came out, we actually looked at a home and we were talking about doubling up mortgage payments or investing after the mortgage is paid off, or investing the difference. We took the same scenario here. So you'll recognize the house value, which was $625. We've got a mortgage about $500,000 on it. So therefore, there's going to be some interest that we're paying each and every month, which of course is interest paid each and every year. We're going to look at everything in an annual basis. Here, I've analyzed and I went to, I've got some links here. I'll put them in the show notes on the show notes page, just so if you want to see where we got some of these assumptions from. Again, we're not trying to suggest this is perfect. I actually tried to make this conservative. I always like to make things more conservative than more aggressive, so that, I would rather you see that, even in maybe a worst case scenario, that, things are clear and cut and dry for you. So I've got property taxes. Mill rates range from 0.5% to 2%. However, we know that property, or some may not, but most may know that property taxes are based on your actual assessed value of the home. So here in Ontario, for example, like MPAC is going to be what I'm paying tax on. So it might not be the true value of the home. You'll notice inflation I'm keeping at like 2%, which means home values are only going up by 2%. So there's not like a huge appreciation on home value here, even though in Canada we tend to see more like a 6%, 7% appreciation range per year on average. Who knows what that's going to look like moving forward? That's, of course, going to impact things, right? The higher the value of homes go every single year, the more important that capital gains exemption is going to be, right? Because you're going to have a greater gain and therefore greater taxes if there's a portion of that home that is left to be taxed. Okay. So that's really important for us to consider. We'll play with some numbers here today, but I want to give you sort of a standard positioning here. We're going to use 0.5% for property taxes, and we're going to do it based on, this appreciated rate here at 2%. Okay. So we're going on the low end of the mill rate at the very, very low end. So that might make up for maybe lagging appraisal rates from assessed rates from like MPAC or any type of organization like that. Property insurance on average about $1,900 in Canada. There's a Rate Hub article about that. So I picked 1,700. I actually made that number lower as well. Why am I doing that? Because I want to show you that even if we're writing off like a low amount, so if these values are lower, that this is still going to be very helpful for you as a Canadian wealth builder. Over here, we've got utilities. We got $5,400 per year on average for water, gas, electricity. So I used $5,400. Again, if that number goes up because your tenants are now using more, more water, gas, electricity than typical for a household, of course, that's going to create more expenses that can be written off as well. Okay. So these are, things, a little bit of give and take here for us to note. So I've got our total expenses per year listed. And what I want to really look at here is like something that may be missed is, when I looked at rents, they said an average rent for a basement dwelling is about $1,500. Now, again, different markets are going to say different things. So here in Windsor, it's probably going to be less. So I'm going to play and push that down in a moment for you to see. But, depending if you're in a large city center, 1,500 might be reasonable. If you're in Toronto, this might be way low, right? If you're right in downtown Toronto. So you do have to consider some of those things. However, if we look at that and then we start thinking to ourselves, well, wait a second, let's just look at the expenses on this household. All right. When we take property tax, interest, remember the mortgage is a $500,000 mortgage. We have it amortized over 25 years. So again, it's going to be different for you. It's going to be different for everyone depending on their actual mortgage. We have a 5% interest rate, by the way. So nothing too crazy, but nothing too low. And when we take the cost of all these expenses per year, in year one is going to be about $35,000 of expenses, just in interest, property tax, property insurance, and utilities. Now, if we assume that we rent 50% of our home, okay, and the reason I picked 50 is because if you're really concerned about losing the capital gains exemption, let's go with a high footprint here. So we're going with like renting a lot of the home. That means I'm going to get to write off a lot of the expenses, half the expenses here, but I'm also going to lose half of the capital gain exemption. So this is really what we're trying to test is the capital gain exemption really, worth it to sacrifice for all of the hassle that goes along with house hacking? So let's have a look here. So we've got total expense of about $35,000. Half of those expenses about $17,500, okay, $17,500, which means we can write off that $17,500. If we think about this for a second, that means that if I'm getting rents of about $17,000, $17,500, first of all, there'd be nothing taxable to me, right? Because I'm getting to write off that income, which is great. And that's an extra $17,500 that I could actually do something else with. Now, my fear for many of us Canadians, because remember, we're all human and humans are the smartest dumb creatures there are. We all make silly choices when it comes down to it. We could like take that extra money and we can spend it, right? Like we could go, well, like I deserve this. We should go out to dinner more because now we've, got this tenant in the basement and whatever. You can choose to do that. That's one thing you can choose, but you could also choose to take that money and invest it instead, right? And start growing it. So we'll look at what that looks like here. We're going to use a 7% growth rate on that. So you'll notice that every year, if we do that, you'll see this bucket's going to get larger and larger, which is really important. It's really helpful. And there will be some capital gains tax on that bucket. Now, I've started with like assuming you're in like an average tax bracket of like 25%. You could push that up and play with some numbers and really see what that is. So even if you're in a really high tax bracket or you're in a high marginal tax bracket, then that number is going to go up. However, let's see how things work here. Now, if we take the average of $1,500 of rent per month and we look at that per year, and that number, let's assume, is going up by 2%, this, same as inflation. So rents are going up just like the value of the home's going up, right? So every year you're going to get a little more rent. You're getting more than $17,500 in rental income. So you will have some taxable income. In year one, we're going to have about $762 of taxable income. If I pay 25% income tax on that, I'm left with $572. And of course, what could I do with that number? Well, I could spend it, or I could actually invest it. And that's what we're doing in this column over here. So you can see here, there's a lot of things going on that are really can lead to some significant help over time. All right. So we have money that we were going to spend anyway. Okay. We have to pay interest. We have to pay our insurance. We have to pay property tax. We have to pay utilities. Okay. Utilities are probably going to go up if you have somebody else living in the household, but it's not going to be double or anything like that, right? It's probably going to be a small percentage that's going to go up. And here we have a very, very small tax bill that this is creating for ourselves, right? And again, still more money in your pocket that you could then reinvest as you see fit. So over time, as we do this and as we do it over a long period of time, you'll notice that up front here in these columns at the end, you'll notice I have like the net worth with renting a percentage of the home. In this case, it's 50%. The net worth without renting a percentage of the home. And then finally, like what's, sort of the arbitrage, like what's the difference from house hacking to not house hacking. And you'll notice here that right from the get-go, even with a house hack and considering the portion of the capital gains tax that you're going to have to pay on your primary residence if you sold it, you're going to be ahead pretty much right off the hop, because we're pocketing half of those expenses that were going out the window anyway. And of course, if we invest those dollars instead of spending those dollars, it's going to add up to something quite substantial. So if we look here and we go down after 10 years, you'll see this particular house hack is going to put you $238,000 ahead, using only a 7% investment number for the expense savings and the additional income savings that you're getting on the house hack. After 20 years, that's going to go up to almost $750,000, just south of it, $748,000. And by the end of the full mortgage term, you're looking at over $1 million, 1.1, almost $1.2 million of arbitrage. Now, I want to try to like break this, okay? Because some people are going to message us after this and they're going to, well, that's really nice for someone who, is in a 5% tax bracket. What about somebody who's in like a higher tax bracket? Well, remember, the more money you bring in and the higher the tax bracket, the more valuable that those expenses are going to be for you, right? Like that's the reality of it, right? It's same as Smith maneuvers. So let's put you in the highest tax bracket, 54%. We're going to assume that when we sell these assets, that it's also going to be 54%. Usually, like when we sell a primary residence or we start, decumulating and selling off assets and capital gains start triggering, usually you're in a lower tax bracket because you're probably not bringing in your active income that you had while you were working throughout your working years. So we're assuming the worst here. Or you put yourself in such a great spot that, you have a fairly extensive lifestyle where you're spending more than say $250 a year every year, even if you were retired right now. So 54% tax here. I'm also going to assume like inflation was like 4% instead. All right. So we're going to adjust that up, meaning like the value of the house is going up more. So it's going to be more aggressive. Let's see what this does over time. And you'll notice that the house hack by year 10, you're still like right off the hop, you're still ahead. Why? Because of income coming in and because of saving on those expenses. And that new income that's coming in is still not being taxed, or at least the vast majority of it. Okay. So you get, you're ahead by like $11,000 in year one. By year 10, you're ahead by 170. By year 25, you're ahead by 928. Right? So we put you in a more aggressive tax bracket, or the most aggressive tax bracket. We're at 54-ish%. We've got inflation at 4% instead. What if we did like 6.8% on the growth of the home, which is sort of the average over, I think it was 20 years. Don't hold me to it. Over 20-ish years in Canada. Maybe it was the last 15, something like that. So like really aggressive inflation on home. And really what I'm saying here by inflation, it's not true inflation. We're talking about the appreciation of the home. I've also got the rent going up by 6.8%, which may not be fair because we're not allowed to aggressively increase rent like that in Ontario. I'll adjust that down in a second. But you'll see we start off with $8,600 ahead. All the way to year 10, we're at $155,000 ahead. Year 25, we're at $1 million ahead still. Now, why that is probably due to the rents going up so aggressively. So let's adjust the rents down. I'm going to adjust rents down so that the rent growth here isn't going to be as aggressive. So here it is going up. It says 7. So let's go back to, like, I'm going to put it, if it's that aggressive, I'm going to put it at, like, let's put it back to 2. Let's just be really dramatic here. Year 1, we're still at 8,300. Year 10, we are at $127,000 ahead. And year 25, $675,000 ahead. So you can see here that by even playing with some of these numbers, you're still going to be massively ahead, even if, let's say, we didn't invest if we didn't invest the savings here. If I put it to a 0% growth rate and we just look at how far ahead you are in general, you are $7,400 ahead by year 1. $61,000 or $62,000 ahead by year 10. And by year 25, you're like $51,000 ahead. And that's assuming you don't invest the difference. You just went and like, you blew the money. It was like, that was extra money in your pocket. Now you spent it, you didn't grow it, but you're still well ahead. So you're not actually losing here by engaging in a house hack. So the real goal for today's episode was really trying to help you figure out whether we're doing something and when we're optimizing, because sometimes people will do something and it doesn't actually make sense. So the Smith maneuver is a great example. Incorporated business owner earns a lot of active income. He takes out a big chunk every year so he can put it down on his mortgage so that he can then do the Smith maneuver. Well, when we do that, we're spending so much money in tax, taking money out of the corporation just to save a little bit of tax each year on the interest income. Doesn't actually make sense in that particular case. What I can tell you about house hacking is that owning a primary residence is very, very costly. And even though the value of the home is going to continue growing over time and appreciating over time, the reality is that there are so many costs that get sunk into that property that if you're able to do a house hack, whether it's 20% of the unit of your property, 50% of the property, whatever it is, you're going to come out ahead regardless of the capital gains exemption you might be giving up. Now, remember, you are giving up some other aspects that aren't as tangible, right? Privacy, having your own space, sharing the driveway, or parking in front of the property, whatever it might be, you are losing those aspects. But if you're able to, it's definitely worth it. So who is it right for? Well, if you're early in your wealth building journey, I would argue definitely. Like, so if you're single, if you're maybe it's a couple with no children and you're both committed to together really trying to have a kickstart here, maybe set yourself a plan, like a 5-year goal where you say, we're going to house hack for 5 years till we build up enough equity in our primary residence so that we could refinance that property and go buy our next property. And that might now be your primary residence. Now you've got a duplex where you're going to rent the top and the bottom, or the 2 units if they're side by side. Doesn't matter what the actual structuring is of the actual building, but get yourself a plan so that you have sort of a goal in mind. For some who are, single and plan to stay single, you might choose to do this for the rest of your life. It's going to put you in such a financially different position than if, let's say, you're going and buying a property yourself and not utilizing income from any other source through, say, a house hack. So if you're wanting to build equity and cash flow faster, this is a great way. And of course, this is a great stepping stone to get you to your next rental property. You get to practice with a tenant with you in the building. And whether you choose to do it through renting out rooms or whether you do it, through actually separating the 2 units so that there's actual legal entrances to both, totally up to you. But just think about how you get to try on this idea of being your own landlord and having your own tenant. You may love it, you may hate it, but one thing I know you won't miss is that portion of the capital gains exemption that you are giving up in order to do so. So, my friends, if you found this helpful, do us a huge favor and hit subscribe on whatever platform you're on right now. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Amazon, please do us a favor, leave us a rating and review. If you're over on YouTube and you were checking out our spreadsheet alongside me here, definitely hit the subscribe button and ring that bell. If you're interested in figuring out where you are along the 4 phases of your Canadian wealth building journey, you should head on over to our discovery page where we'll ask you some questions and you'll be able to get yourself a customized report with where things are going well for you and where you can focus your attention and energy next to make sure that you get a jumpstart on your wealth building journey. Head on over to CanadianWealthSecrets.com/discovery. Once again, that is CanadianWealthSecrets.com/discovery. And of course, for those who are interested in reaching out to us, you'll have an opportunity to book a call and hop on a discovery call with myself or John. And we're looking forward to hanging out with you sometime soon. All right, Canadian Wealth Secret Seekers, we will see you next time. And just a reminder that this is not investment advice. This is entertainment and educational only. It is for information. You should not construe any information or other material as legal, tax, investment, financial, accounting, or any other type of advice. I am Kyle Pierce, and I am a life licensed and accident and sickness licensed, and I am the president of Canadian Wealth Secrets Incorporated, alongside with John Orr.